Welcome to Beyond the Reiki Gateway, a podcast reserved for the spiritually curious. Journey further with Reiki Masters Kathleen Johnson and Andrea Kennedy through in-depth conversations, many featuring inspiring and intriguing special guests to enrich your unique spiritual progression. Welcome to Beyond the Reiki Gateway. I'm Andrea Kennedy here with my co-host Kathleen Johnson and Simon Bown. And what a topic do we have for you today? Simon Bown is the host of the Past Lives podcast, and he has a diploma in clinical hypnotherapy and is certified in past life regression therapy. He specializes in taking people through past life regressions. And he's had many paranormal experiences on his own, including psychic flashes, UFO sightings, and a number of strange events not easily explained. These have proved to him that there is something more to us than flesh and blood, and that we are energetic beings working through a cycle of reincarnation. In addition to his past life work, he's also produced over 250 episodes for his podcast. Very popular, it has received over 1.5 million downloads and is at the top of the charts in the UK and the US. Simon, we're thrilled to have you with us here and can't wait to dive into this very popular topic here, Beyond the Reiki Gateway.
It's really nice to be here. Thanks a lot for inviting me.
Our pleasure.
Oh, we're very excited. Yes. And as I mentioned in our email communications, Simon, our audience is always interested in learning more about past lives. And I also mentioned that I'm a past life regression therapist as well. So it's always fun to meet a fellow regression therapist, but it's even more fun to get differing perspectives on this issue. And that's why we like to have people come on and just talk about it from their experience and their perspective and how they see it. Because honestly, we just never really know exactly what happens because it's spirit, right? We're really happy you're here.
Thanks a lot. I was talking to another lady who does past life regression, and it was interesting little things we were talking about. She hadn't talked to anybody about before, but it was consistent with the things that I was seeing. And it was just a kind of a little confirmation that these things are real in a way, that there's consistency amongst everybody that does this.
Exactly. I've noticed that too. And you use the word consistency, which is the word I tend to use. The consistency is very comforting. That's the word I like to use because you know you're on the right track. But there are deviations because we're each unique individuals and we approach this in our own unique way. So I'd like to know, okay, first of all, how did you get started working with past lives?
I've always had a fascination with the paranormal and unexplained things and supernatural. Even when I was 10 years old, I was taking books out of the library that could be UFOs or ghosts. It could be Bigfoot or just anything. And over time, maybe you'd say matured, and that I became just interested in two things. It's UFOs and the afterlife. And in the late 1980s, I'm showing how old I am now, that I used to visit the College of Psychic Studies in London. I wasn't a student there, but you could go there and book time with people. There'd be clairvoyants, mediums, psychics, channels, people who do past life regression. And so you could book time with the students or you could book time with the teachers. And so it's about 1987, the first time I was taken through a past life regression. And it just worked straight away. And I went straight into this past life. And when I was a small child, to begin with, I could see the parents there and they had a big pram with a baby in it. And I just knew the baby was my sister. And the father was there and he had this big moustache. And I think it was about 1895. We were in this park in London and I just knew that the father in that life is my best friend in this life. And that's one of the things you see, isn't it? That souls incarnate together in different lives. But also another thing was that the park was a bit peculiar in London in that it was on quite a steep slope. And if you were a town planner, that's the last place you'd look at it and think, hey, that's a great place for a park. couple of years later, I was going through a place in North London I'd never been to before. And there was the park, exactly as I'd seen it in the past life regression. And the houses in the area were these big Victorian houses that looked just like what I had seen in this past life regression. So, that's interesting. You see that kind of confirmation. And also seeing somebody, who in this life, I know them again. And so that was my beginning really with past life regression. Over the years, I would do another one and another one. So I'd see all sorts of past lives. And eventually I got to the point where I was like, I want to do this as well. So I did a course in clinical hypnotherapy that was 10 months. And I was at college. We did, hundreds of hours, and we would practice on each other. And I learned all the kind of hypnotherapy things like stopping smoking and helping people lose weight and dealing with phobias. And then after that, I got certified in past life regression therapy. I wanted to do it properly, not just start up by myself. That's how it started really, from 1987, and getting hooked on it and going further into it.
What an in-depth program that sounds like that was. When you were describing the 10 months and all the different subject matter, and wow, that would be something I think I would love to do, it sounds like you were immersed in that. And so now you offer sessions for people, right? You do that for them and lead them into their own past lives.
Yeah, I do. I've been doing one a day, sometimes two a day for quite a while now. And it's amazing what comes up. And, when you take somebody through a past life regression, you don't know what's going to come up. You don't direct them to a particular life. I know what Kathleen would say about this, but the idea I have is that it's your spirit guides, your higher self that choose which life you would see during a past life regression. And I'm always conscious of that when I'm going through a past life with somebody. I think they're seeing this for a reason. Their spirit guides want them to see this for some reason. So you kind of try and analyze and find out what's happening. And sometimes people could be in quite mundane, dull situations. And you're thinking, why are we here? What's really going on? When you get to the end of the session, you see how this is very insightful for their lives and can be quite healing and helpful. And also, part of the session, the way I do it, is that we encounter the spirit guide and we can ask them all sorts of questions about the session, about the person, about their soul. I've got so many questions to ask them. And it's remarkable what comes up. And you have techniques to help. If something comes up that seems like a negative impact on this life, you can try and break the bond to the past life or release negative energy. And also you can ask the spirit guide about that and ask if there's maybe unresolved karma coming through, or if the spirit guide can help with some healing and what advice they can give. So it's just amazing what comes up.
I have a question about that, Simon. In the conversation with the spirit guide, is it the person you're working with asking the questions of the spirit guide and then hearing or sensing the answers from the spirit guide? How does the conversation go?
It works where I ask the question, but my client will get the answer because my client's hypnotized. They've got their eyes closed. They'll be getting this visual in their mind's eye of being in this space. And they'll be able to describe what the spirit guide looks like most of the time. Sometimes the spirit guide doesn't show up. It's almost this thing, it's up to them if they want to show up. I can't guarantee it. And occasionally people say it's not a spirit guide, it's their grandmother. And I've had people say, I don't think it's a spirit guide, it looks more like an angel. And there was a guy the other day said it looked like him, like he had shown up. And I said, well, maybe it's your higher self that's presenting themselves. With the conversation as well, people tend to get the answer from the spirit guide. It's almost like an information dump or a download or an understanding. It's not sentences. And I talked to a guy the other day and he got something from his spirit guide. And he said it came in an instant and there's so much in it. He couldn't verbalize what came from the spirit guide, but it got this understanding, these three things that came straight down. And it's almost like they'll get it in a second, but it could take them 20 minutes to explain it, the understanding they get.
That sounds very similar to the way I conduct my sessions as well. Just I look upon it as I'm a facilitator, but the content is definitely guided by spirit. I don't have any say in that. The meeting with the guides, yeah, that's in there too. And it's always really interesting because what you just described about the client who just got this information dumped, like in a matter of a split second, a lot of times, in my experience anyway, the client really doesn't have access to that information initially, but it starts to come up over time as needed for that person. So I refer to it as the gift that keeps on giving. I said, you may get a flash of insight months from now about something that happened here today. And I'm wondering if that's ever happened in your experience.
I get emails back occasionally from clients saying something like that, some kind of healing. And occasionally they say they've had a dream, and it might be the night after the session, something happens. And also, the healing that comes can be physical and quite unexpected. And I had a woman who, she came to me, I think it was for a phobia. But during the past life regression, she was in a forest. She stepped in a bear trap, and those big metal claws came up and grabbed her leg in this past life. But she said in this life, she's had eczema on that part of her leg her whole life. And she tried everything with doctors and natural remedies, couldn't get rid of it. But after the hypnotherapy, it completely cleared up and disappeared. And we weren't looking for that. It was like you say, a spirit is guiding. It's like the spirit guides were saying, no, we've got something for you. We're going to show you how this happened, and we can clear this thing up.
Right.
I love how you brought up the healing aspect, Simon. And I'm wondering if you could share more with us about that benefit, about past life regression, and talk more about the positive outcomes that people can actually realize from these sorts of sessions.
Yeah. So the physical side of things I've seen, there was a guy who came to me with this stomach pain that he just could not explain, and the doctors couldn't work out what it was. And I think he was about 60 years old, and he'd had it for years. And we saw a past life where he was stabbed in the stomach, and he came back for another session. There was a situation where he was terribly guilty about something he'd done in this past life. And he said he could feel this knot in his stomach, this guilt. And so we did a release of that, this negative energy. A little later, he emailed me and said that the pain had decreased in his stomach by quite a lot. And it hadn't completely gone, but he said he'd sit in front of the TV poking himself in the belly because he couldn't believe how much the pain had decreased. And he kept checking it. But also there's feelings as well. There was a woman who came to me with this tremendous feeling of guilt. And she looked back on her life. She got no reason to be guilty. We went into 3 different past lives in one session. And there was one where she was a doctor. This is the Victorian era, it looked like. And she was a man in that life. And she was called out to a birth, and somebody had given birth in their house. And the baby was there. And as a doctor, she could tell the baby wasn't going to survive. And they felt terribly guilty because as a doctor, they felt they should be able to do something, but they couldn't do anything. And then we went to this other life where she found herself to be an old woman in bed, and she was dying. And there was a young girl sitting in a chair next to the bed, and she knew the parents weren't around. And if she died, the child would go into an orphanage. And this was like 300 years ago. The orphanages, terrible places. So she felt terribly guilty of dying and leaving this child to go into an orphanage. So you could see how in those lives, there was such guilt, and it was coming through into this life. And it seemed to be a thing of just learning about it was so helpful. And I remember after we finished the hypnosis, I could see her on Zoom, and she just looked bewildered. And she said, I don't know what just happened to me. Sometimes there are people I see in tears when they're on Zoom, but they're not crying and sobbing so much. It's like all these tears streaming down their face. And I think it's like an energy release, an emotional release. And they talk about how they feel a great weight has been lifted after the session. Yeah, it's fascinating.
It is.
Yeah, the healing aspect of the past lives process is, I think, sometimes underrated or underreported because some people, I don't know about your experience, but some people come to it mostly out of a sense of curiosity. Have you ever had people come in? I have, who say, "Oh, I think I was, pick somebody, Cleopatra." And then they go into the session and they have, as you said earlier, this mundane, rather ordinary life. And they're kind of disappointed, I can tell. But then when they go into the conversation with their guide, it's like, oh, now I get it. So, but a lot of people come in out of a sense of curiosity, just, ooh, what this all about? Sounds cool. But they don't really consider the healing aspect of it until it happens. And what has been your experience with that?
Yeah, it seems like the guides will almost direct somebody or push somebody into doing a past life regression. The client thinks it's their idea, but actually it's the spirit guides are putting little nuggets in their sort of the subconscious to move them down this pathway. They're giving them little nudges. And it maybe because the spirit guides, they've got something lined up. They want to show them, they want to help them with something. When they come in, they say, well, mostly it's just curiosity. And I send out a form to fill out, an intake form, and I ask, why do you want to do a past life regression? And they might say, well, I didn't really want to do something to do with therapy, but if I had to write something on the form, I got this phobia of snakes, or I don't like being a passenger in a car or something. And then we'll go into the past life and they'll get therapy even though they weren't looking for it. It's also sometimes it is just exploration. And we could jump between 2 or 3 lives. There's not really any therapy there, but people still get a lot out of it because it's like you say, they might think something like Cleopatra might come up or Atlantis, but they find they were a housewife in the 1950s and not much happened.
Right. I've found that most of the past lives that are accessed are fairly ordinary lives, nothing terrible. Some of them are pretty grim, there's no question, but all of them are what spirit determined that this person needed to see at that time. And that's the whole point.
Yeah, it's almost like near-death experiences. The people that have near-death experience seem to get just what they need, and the spirit world, whoever's in charge of their near-death experience, they know them so well. They know exactly what to give them to maybe move them onto the right path in their life. Maybe they veered off it or something. I think it's 10 or 12% of people who die and are resuscitated have a near-death experience. The rest just don't. And it may be because from a spiritual point of view, they don't need a near-death experience. They're doing just fine.
Right. That's an interesting take on that. I haven't thought of that either. It's sort of the near-death experience could be considered a course correct in their lives. It sounds like that's what you're saying. Is that correct?
Yeah, I sometimes imagine the spirit guides, they're sitting wherever they sit and looking down on someone and start to think, oh man, we've got to have a word with them. Let's give them a near-death experience. They need to kick up the pants.
Yeah. Little timeout.
Yeah.
A little wake-up call here. Yeah.
Yeah. But inquiring minds do want to know, have any famous lifetimes come up in your sessions at all?
No, never.
No? Really? Interesting.
I've seen people go to ancient Egypt and also to so far back in time, you probably couldn't name a year. They were just hunter-gatherers or cavemen. Occasionally also lives on other planets, that's come up. But no, nobody famous.
Interesting. As the facilitator of these experiences for your clients, what have you learned? It has to be incredibly educational for you to have these glimpses and this knowledge come through for your clients. And I have to imagine that you've formulated a bit of a landscape or beliefs about the world and reincarnation. And can you share with us what you've put together?
Well, one thing is when we talk to the spirit guides, when we're finishing that kind of meeting, I always say, is there something else that the spirit guide wants to tell you? Is there they have a message for you? Is there something they think you should know? And so often they say, we are always with you and we're always on your side. And, it's like we're always loving you. We're always want the best for you. So that's one thing that I get through from that. But there's another thing when I've gone through the past lives where I've been female, when I've gone into those past lives, it hasn't felt weird. It's felt completely natural. And so I've learned little things that give me a perspective of being female, which was stuff that's unexpected. But that life I was telling you about, the first time I did a past life regression, I went into, I was a girl when it started. And then I found myself as a nurse in the First World War. And I was in a field tent that was maybe just a couple of miles back from the front line. And there was all these men coming in with terrible injuries and they'd just been hurt. And we had to do so much work. I can almost smell what it smelt like to be in these, there were long canvas tents with all these hospital beds and all these gas lamps lighting it and people rushing up and down at any time of the day or night. And I remember the nurse's uniform with these long skirts down to your ankles. And I remember moving between the beds and getting annoyed because my skirts were getting in the way. That's not something I'd ever experienced. But in regression, it felt like I'd had this annoyance for quite a while, weeks or months. Like every day this had been annoying me. It didn't feel like this was the first time I was feeling like that. And then later on, I was taken through a past life regression, and that was maybe just 3 or 4 years ago. So I did that first one in 1987. 3 or 4 years ago, I did another past life regression. I went to that life again, but this time I was older. And I remember seeing this scene where I was on the street with this man and there was a car there. And I got the impression he was the husband and he was just about to get in the car. He was going somewhere and he was treating me really badly. Like I was just a silly woman, almost like very condescending and patronizing. And I felt really quite angry. And I had this feeling of, I did all this stuff in the war where I dealt with this terrible stuff for months on end. And I'm not just a silly little woman. You don't know what I'm capable of and you don't know what I did. And I really felt angry at that point. So it was interesting as well to be on that side of it, to have that, I don't know if you call it prejudice or that kind of arrogance coming from a man towards me. It was very insightful to see those, those points of view.
Yeah, that is really something. And to be able to have the perspective while you're still in this life, that could be so important for somebody as they move forward in their relationship. Wow, that's really something.
Andrea is much kinder than I am. I'm sitting here thinking there's a lot of guys I can think of that I'd like to have them go through what you just Here you go. This is how we feel.
Welcome to our world.
The past life regressions I've had, the ones that I've actually experienced, honestly, I've been a male in more of those experiences than female. It is an interesting perspective and very different from the life, I live now. I hadn't thought about the gender difference, but yeah, there's a big difference.
Well, it's just a thought I had. I don't know if other people have thought of this before, about young souls and older souls and how they behave. And I was thinking that people in life, if they're a younger soul, they might not have had lives as the opposite gender. And maybe they haven't had lives where they were gay or they were different race. And so they haven't felt the prejudice that those people feel. And so they're prejudiced in this life because they don't have the empathy. They haven't lived lives where they've suffered those things. So that's what I was going to say. It's a different viewpoint.
It's a really good point.
That's a little bit about what I'd like to get your take on. The ideas of old souls, new souls. How many times do we reincarnate? What have you put together about how this all works?
It's difficult, isn't it? I think from our point of view as humans, we live in a world, our perception is that there's time passing and everything's linear. But in the afterlife, there is no time. There isn't time passing. And so when you get that idea of old souls and young souls, if there's no time, how could you get old? Are they creating new souls? And
Right.
but then if time doesn't exist, weren't they all created at the same moment? It does get confusing. There's that idea, if time doesn't exist, that means your soul is experiencing all of your lives in the same moment. And I kind of see it as like a tree, where the tree trunk is you and your soul. Each leaf is a different life, and the tree is experiencing all those leaves all at the same time. It may be, as well as going to past lives, you could go to future lives. And also, by having a past life regression, it can help you in this life. But maybe you could do something in this life that would help a life you had 200 years ago, and you could make that life better. And all these influences start coming in. It gets more confusing, and you think about how time passing and time not passing. And also, a lot of people think of reincarnation as being, it's you, one soul, and 100% of your soul goes into each life, and you move one life to the next. But actually, your soul's only putting a percentage of itself in each life. And it might even have another life at exactly the same moment as you're living now. Your soul may be living as somebody else somewhere else. So it gets more complicated, more confusing. You have to spend time in this reincarnation world learning all these things and taking this knowledge in and letting it digest and getting an understanding of it. And you hear people in near-death experiences talk about how they see time as a river, and you can walk up and down the riverbank and you can jump in anytime you want and go to different places. And there was a client who lived a life, and they saw the spirit guide afterwards, and the spirit guide said, "You didn't learn your lesson. You got to go back and you got to live another life."
That's right.
And try and learn that lesson again. And I had a past life regression where I saw 3 different lives. And the lesson to learn from that life was about rejection. But the way it worked out was the first life I saw, it was this man in Mexico who just really wasn't very clever, and he couldn't hold down a job. And after his parents died, he had nowhere to live, and he became a beggar on the streets of this town. And everybody in the town thought of him as just a nuisance. And so he was kind of rejected by everybody. And then I saw another life where I was in a relationship with somebody. They went off to visit their family in the country, and they wrote a letter back saying, "Oh, I'm not coming back. I'm getting married." And so that was another way of being rejected. And so it seems like there are such different ways you could be rejected. You've got to live 20 or 30 lives just to learn that one lesson. So you can see how you might need thousands of lives to learn so much stuff, because the soul comes here to learn everything that there is to learn about being human. And I also had a spirit guide kind of laugh in a way when we talked about lives on other planets. And almost like they were saying, "Do you humans so arrogant? You think that your planet is the only one with life? There's life everywhere."
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. That's the word I use, arrogance. Do we really think that we're it in this vast, maybe multiverse? Seriously? I know. Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that.
And what can you share about what you've learned about other worlds? And, we mentioned UFOs. You had some UFO sightings and some other interesting things. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, from one point of view, I had a client, and we did 3 sessions. And with the spirit guide, we said, "How many past lives have you had?" And the spirit guide said, "1. Well, 1 on Earth. This is it, your first life on Earth." And in one of the
Wow.
past lives, we went to a world that was almost all water, and he was some kind of creature. I wouldn't say like a dolphin or a whale, but something like that. And that they were intelligent, they had a civilization, and his job was to look after this really huge creature. And I think that as they got older on that world, they got bigger and bigger. And this creature was kind of a really powerful psychic, and it was sending out positive energy around the planet. And there was a group of them there. He was expected to take on that role when he got so much older. And also the spirit guide kind of said, that was you being in training to come to Earth, because Earth is a really tough place. And once you get to Earth, your job is to send out this positive spiritual energy, because the Earth really needs it. The Earth's a tough school, but it's also this idea that we need the Earth. We need it to be a tough school because that's what it's here for. But on the other side, with aliens and UFOs, there are people, they claim to have been abducted by aliens, and some of them might protest and shout at the aliens, "You can't do this. You've got no right." And the aliens say, "But you agreed to this before you were born. It's in the contract." And you're not necessarily going to know about it. It's a question I ask the spirit guides when we're in the session is, are there any pre-life agreements that you should be aware of? Yeah, when I saw UFOs 2 times, I've had a really good sighting of a UFO. I was out in a town called High Wycombe, which is west of London, and you have to get on this motorway to come into town. And I was out gigging with my band. It was a Sunday night. I loaded up the car and I was heading back into town. It was like 1 a.m. on a Monday morning, and there were no other vehicles around. I was the only car, and it was still countryside where I was. And I knew the motorway well, and I know there's no buildings around, but off to the left, there was a really bright light. And I was slowing down. I was thinking, that's really odd. There's nothing there. Maybe there's emergency works. Maybe it's electricity or a gas main's, leaking or something. And there were some trees up there. And, we drive on the left. So it was on my side of the motorway. And I slowed down to maybe 5 miles an hour because, there's no other cars around. And I looked up, and just as I got past the trees, there was this craft there shaped like a rugby ball. And it was the size of a large house, maybe 30 feet off the ground, 200 feet from me. And it was completely silent, didn't move an inch the whole time. And I was leaning forward in my seat, looking up at it through the windscreen, going really slowly. And it had loads and loads of red pinned spots, sort of lights across one half of the bottom of it. And this was about 1993. And, maybe you'd see that now with LED lights. They can be really bright and colorful.
Right.
But I don't think we had them in 93. And there was a really powerful spotlight coming from the other end of it, pointed at the ground. I just kind of looked at it, and I was leaning forward for like 20 or 30 seconds. I got a really good look at it. And you think, you go through like a mental checklist. You think, well, it's not a helicopter. It's not an airplane. It's not a hot air balloon. You just couldn't explain what it was. But I'm also a little skeptical as well. What I'd say is, I'm not saying it was definitely an alien spaceship, but I don't know what it was. It looked like one. Also, there's this thing called missing time where people see UFOs, and then they find, and I went home and I checked the clock and there was no missing time. And I thought, oh, thank God for that. No missing time. But I did wonder if that spotlight pointing at the ground, maybe, because they kind of show it lifting things with that beam of light that comes out of the UFO, maybe they're lifting something up.
That's what I thought when you mentioned that beam of light coming down. I thought, oh no, did it pass over you?
I know. Here he goes. Do you mind sharing the second one with us, Simon?
There's a sort of synchronicity with that, or a coincidence. It depends how you view it. Again, I was gigging with my band. This time I was living in Dorset on the south coast of England. And to drive up to this town in Reading that's west of London, you have to go through a national park. It's called the New Forest. And as it's a national park, it's very strongly controlled. You can't build there. You definitely couldn't have fireworks or fires or anything. And so I'm driving on this road, and there's no street lamps over it. And it's all just countryside around. And about half a mile to the right-hand side, there's a big ball of orange light. People might call them orbs, but this thing was about the size of a car, and it was just above a tree, and it didn't move an inch the whole time. All the ground underneath it was lit up, and I was looking at it and driving and looking forwards and then looking to the side and looking forwards and kept looking at it. Lots of cars about, and the way the road is, it's just bushes on each side. There's no way you can stop and take a look at it. So I drove up to Reading and we did the gig, and then driving back, and it was maybe 1:30 or 2 o'clock in the morning. And I'm listening to a podcast, this guy called Mike Cleland, and he's talking to somebody called Joe Montaldo, who's a real kind of alien abduction expert. And Mike Cleland's telling him about how a few years before he was at his parents' house, which is out in a ranch. There's no buildings around it. And he woke up and there was this bright light coming through the window. And he got up on his elbows and looked out the window, and there were 5 of these gray aliens walking towards the house.
Oh, wow.
And so there's this big ball of light out there. Just as I got to the point where I saw that big ball of light, Joe Montaldo says, "And you know what that ball of light was now, don't you?" And it felt like he was talking to me because it was the exact spot where I'd seen that ball of light.
That's crazy.
Oh my goodness. Talk about synchronicity, as you said, right?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. That's amazing. And those were the 2 experiences. It's interesting that they coincided with the gigs of your band. I wonder if that means anything.
I haven't thought about that, actually. That's a good point.
I know. I thought, wow, your music attracts certain attention, maybe.
Drawing them in. Yeah, I love it. I really do. Thanks for sharing this. I appreciate it. I want to circle back to something you said earlier about the pre-birth contracts. A lot of people don't really know about that, but I think it's something worth discussing a bit because it plays a very big part in our current lives. Would you mind explaining that a bit and describing how that can play out in one's life?
Yeah, the impression I get is that we all have a soul group, and it's a whole group of souls that you work with across many lives, and you take on different roles in different lives. There's ideas of a soulmate and a twin flame and those kind of things, but I would say that a soulmate doesn't necessarily mean it's romantic. It just means it's a soul that works with you a lot. And it's almost like putting on a play, is how I see it. Before you're born, you're with your soul group and you've all got the scripts, and it's like, okay, who's going to be dad? Who's going to be mum? Who's going to be, the guy that does something real bad to me so I can learn this lesson? You work together. And so you have that pre-life agreement that how they're going to behave in your life, but you have an agreement with them how you're going to behave in their life. And you might do something that's really going to help them learn a lesson. So this is where these pre-life agreements come in and how the soul groups work together. And it's also interesting to me that there's a point before you're born where you choose your body, and you choose a body that would be just right for that life you're going to live. And so you might choose, okay, I'm going to be overweight in this life because I need to learn a lesson about that. Or I'm going to be really short, or I'm going to be terribly handsome. And, I remember I was taken through a life between lives session, and we got to that point where I was choosing the body. And I saw it like I was in a department store, and there was all these bodies in these glass cabinets, and you're walking past them and choosing one. And I remember I chose a body that's very strong, but not like strong with muscles, strong that if it became ill, it could fight off the illness. And that's one of the things I remember from that session. So that's the pre-life agreements. And I think they can get very complicated, and all sorts of people can be in there. And I think sometimes there may be a soul that's very close to you that you work with a lot in lots of lives. But in your current life, you might just meet them for 5 minutes or just for a couple of weeks. And they're the sort of people you meet them and you just have that feeling of familiarity and a feeling that you know them already and you're on the same wavelength.
Exactly.
And also you can meet people that you instant dislike as well.
Mm-hmm.
But it's always a shock to the system when you meet someone for the first time, allegedly, and you just know who they are. That's happened to me twice in my lifetime. And both times it was just, and this was even before I was even involved in past life work, but you just knew. The response in my head was, "Oh, it's you." And then I'm thinking, what are you talking about? You don't know this person. But it is such an interesting, shocking kind of revelation. And has that ever happened with you, Simon?
one thing that stands out is meeting somebody I didn't like immediately. And I had a problem with my heating boiler in my house. And so I called a plumber, and he came over. And the second I met him, there was a real strong dislike. I don't know what it was. And I showed him the boiler, and he took a circuit board out, and he said, it's going to need a new circuit board. It's going to be about £300. And I was like, oh, okay, well, we've got to get it done. We've got to have heating. And he said, all right, I'll go off and I'll get the new board. And he went off, and he'd left the boiler, the front hanging off it. And I was looking at the circuit board, and there was this little fuse that cost, like, we call it 50 pence. And it had blown. And so I got hold of another fuse. I had some in the drawer. I put it in, and the boiler sprung up working just fine. And I think he knew that, and he was going to charge me £300 for a fix.
Oh, my goodness.
So I just called him up, said, don't bother coming back. But I don't know. You could say maybe it's a psychic thing, and you knew, or I knew in some way that he was going to rip me off, and it was nothing to do with a past life. But as soon as he came through the door, there was something there.
Yeah. You just know sometimes, right? It's that clear cognizance. You don't really know how you know, but you just do. So interesting. Good thing you found out it was just a fuse.
I like your description of the play and sorting out the roles beforehand. I've often thought of it like that myself. So I just wanted to bring up this notion about forgiveness and what we're doing here in our lifetime, because if we resonate with that idea that we're working it out before our lifetime, and you mentioned people agreeing about, oh, well, okay, I'll do that to you so that you can learn this. And, and it might be a very bad, painful thing that they're doing. But before the lifetime, what you're suggesting here is that there's an agreement to have these very difficult and painful circumstances play out in a lifetime. I just find that incredibly interesting to ponder, because when we're in life and things happen and people do things to us, oh my goodness, the emotional and the mental and so much suffering can happen based on these actions. And I'm just wondering if you have anything to offer us from your experience about that.
I suppose there's the soul point of view, and there's your current life's point of view. Your soul may have an overview, and you can really learn something from some suffering in some places in some point. And so the soul might be thankful to the other soul that it's helping learn this lesson, but that doesn't help you in your life, does it?
Right.
You got to work through it in your current life as well. It's also a thing that you have pre-life agreements and you have a life plan, but they're not set in stone. You can go off the plan, and people can come in and do things that are not part of the plan. And I once I've talked to him a few times, this guy, Richard Martini, and he's got a good podcast and YouTube channel. If they took somebody back to a past life and they were a Nazi, and they said in the pre-life setup that they knew it's going to be a tough life. And it was almost like the soul group was agreeing it's going to be tougher to be the perpetrator than the victim, because the victim's not guilty of anything, doesn't have that weight on them, but coming through as a perpetrator, it's worse in a way. And so it's not like forgiving or saying Nazis were good in any way, but it's like the soul's agreeing to set up some really bad karma for several lives to come, just to help out another soul in their soul group.
It becomes very complex. And I'm glad you brought that issue up, Andrea. It also tends to foster compassion, at least for me, because when you understand that this is something that, was meant to be, this is something you agreed to, it tends to, at least for me, foster compassion for those who have wronged me. I can see it from that soul perspective that you said, and it takes some of the sting out of it. Going, okay, I get it. And chances are we did learn a lesson because of whatever that person did. And once you realize that, it makes a big difference. So you have that compassion element and that forgiveness. Maybe it's not possible to forgive them in this lifetime, but I don't even think that's necessary. So I'm really glad you brought that topic up, Andrea, because I think that's a big part of it. And it gets so complex.
Yeah. Well, the other thing too is it really shines a light on this whole idea of judgment and the right and wrong, because
Exactly.
we've probably all done it all, at one time or another, in one lifetime or another. And so I think it can help our perspective, maybe.
It comes up in near-death experiences when people have the life review, and they say that the only judgment you get in the afterlife is you judging yourself. And when you've taken through a life review, you experience everything you did from the other person's perspective. So if you hurt someone, you feel that hurt yourself when you understand what you caused. And for some people in near-death experiences, they talk about how their life review is so tough, and it really shows them how they're living their life perhaps in the wrong way, and they change so fundamentally for the rest of their lives and how they treat people, and they become so much kinder and less materialistic. And that's one of the things about near-death experiences, people change for the rest of their lives.
That's a whole nother fascinating topic, isn't it? Near-death experiences.
Oh, it really is.
We'll have to tackle that one on the podcast too, Kathleen. But Simon, you've probably talked about so many different things on your podcast, having so many episodes, and it's so popular, as we said at the top of the show. Can you share your website with the listeners so we can invite them to find out more about everything that you're doing?
Well, the podcast website is pastliveshypnosis.co.uk. And on there, you can find all the episodes of the Past Lives podcast. And also, you can book sessions with me to do past life regression. And I offer a free consultation course. So you can book that on the booking page of my website. You can find my calendar, book in a time and date that suits you, and it will just go straight into my calendar. And it's 20 minutes free call to discuss doing a past life regression.
Nice.
That's generous.
That really is. That's wonderful. And Simon, do you have any final thoughts to share with our audience?
If I've had any message for listeners at all, it's something I said earlier, that the spirit guides always say they're with you and they're always on your side. And if you need help, you should ask for it. Just say it out loud at some point. It's almost like prayer, I suppose. But they won't help you unless you ask for it, because they respect your free will and your experience.
Exactly. And that's really, really good advice. They're always with us and they're willing to help. And you make an excellent point. We have to ask them, because they're not going to interfere as much as they would probably like to on occasion, I think. Simon, it's been wonderful having you here. I could talk about this all day. It's just one of my absolute favorite topics. I know our listeners enjoy it too. And you obviously have a lot of experience and probably so many other stories to share. So thank you for being here. And we'll have all your contact information in our show notes so that anyone who wishes to follow up from this podcast will be able to reach you easily. Once again, thank you so much. And it's been a real pleasure meeting you.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot for asking me.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you. We thank you again for joining us. And of course, we invite you to join us next time as we journey beyond the Reiki Gateway with Kathleen Johnson and Andrea Kennedy.